Respond to your questions. Kimberly Stearns and I, if you recall, did a psych survey several weeks ago where as many of you as we could get to answer the questionnaire gave us some results, and Kimberly's going to give us a little report on this. It's kind of interesting because it's the first time we've done this particular kind of survey, and some of you might like to know what the results were. Want to come on up?
Different perspective up here. Out of the 75 surveys that were handed out, we received 57 responses, which we thought was pretty good. And out of those responses, 36 people were registered SSU students, 17 were unregistered but attending the series, 2 were SSU faculty, and 1 was an Open University student. And we had several different questions. In response to the question of what motivated people to attend the lecture series, we found that many people had an intellectual interest in the subject. We had a few respondents who were of Jewish ancestry or had a relative who was in the Holocaust. We also had a few survivors respond, as well as World War II veterans who were motivated naturally by their own involvement. Emotionally, most people responded with, we listed a bunch of different emotions in ways in which people could respond. The most common responses were grief, anger, repulsion, sympathy, and empathy. We only had one respondent admit to feeling indifferent to the lecture series. Put that in so that, maybe people, if they weren't affected, they could respond that way too. Generally, the most common response to Dr. Steiner's account of his experiences in a Nazi death camp were severe shock and a sense of being overwhelmed by the intensity of his experiences. One student also responded by admitting that although Professor Steiner's account was horrifying, she felt that the only way we could really learn was from the accounts of actual survivors. And although most people did their feelings with someone, many still felt the need for some form of an emotional outlet or psychological support. Out of the 4 types of support proposed, the majority said that they wanted more class time devoted to emotional and psychological issues. And we'd just like to thank you, all of you who responded, for responding, because although this survey may not benefit you directly, it'll help us in the future to shape the Holocaust lecture series so we can meet the psychological needs of the students. Thank you.
Thanks, Kimberly. I have more of the handouts for Dr. Steiner's fall class that will be next semester. It's cross-listed in sociology, psychology, and probably will be in poli-sci also for any of you who would be interested in taking a 4-unit class, which will be an intensive study of the Holocaust where you can have a lot more of your questions answered and study more in depth. What's that? Genocide. Sociology of the Holocaust and genocide. So we'll be talking about broader issues than just the Holocaust. We'll be talking about genocide and human rights and other important related issues. It will be on Thursday nights from 6 to 10 for any of you who are planning your schedules already. And I'll pass these out for anybody else that didn't get one already.
Carol, would you poll the audience or those who are considering taking it?
That's a good idea. And then you want to come up and
Yeah.
Jean thought maybe we should have a hand count to see how many people might be planning to take the course, if we have any, can have any kind of an idea of that. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so.
We have a question.
Yes.
Can we audit?
It needs
No.
Registered students.
registered students and also,
Some background.
yeah, people need, I think you need the consent of the instructor for one, who is Dr. Steiner, but primarily it's designed as a class, so you need to have already taken this lecture series so that you have an overview or have some background material. If you're a senior citizen, there is a special rate through the extended ed or Open University whereby you don't have to pay for all 4 units. There's a some unit rate that they're working on. If you are a senior citizen and would like to take the class for credit. We really need at least a dozen people to sign up for the class or we can't offer it. So if you have any interest at all, please come and talk to us so we have some kind of who might be involved. Jean has something to say here.
First, I'd like to know how many people here have taken advantage of the tapes we have made of the lectures here for review and work on your papers. Can I see a show of hands, please? Well, okay, I personally been involved in the lecture series and in the taping for a number of years, and I want to thank Paula, our camera person back there, for the excellent job that she has done this year.
Okay, I'm going to ask the panelists to come on down. Whoops, this just fell apart. To come on down and sit at the table, and if we don't have enough chairs, we'll pull up some more. Phil, you want to join us too? I think that'd be appropriate. You've been, involved in the lecture series all along, and it'll be just a question and discussion time. So there might be people who would specifically ask you about your panel, on the German issue, whatever. Down.
Ja, natürlich. Selbstverständlich.
Bob, are you coming? Come on. It does look a little crowded, but you're going to pass. We'll expect some comments, historical comments from the back then at some point. Anyway, just for those of you who are not familiar with all the faculty that we have here, I will go ahead and reintroduce people. Bob Brown in the back from the History Department, speaking with him, and who will be down here in a minute, Sterling Bennett from German or Language Studies, Harold from Philosophy, John Steiner from Sociology, and also the Holocaust Study Center Director, Paul Benko, who we have not had the privilege of seeing too much this semester, but he's also a survivor and has been involved in the past, so that you can ask him specific questions also, as well as Dr. Steiner. Yes, excuse me, and he's professor of biology. I might have gotten to that if you hadn't interrupted me. Anyway, he's also a Holocaust survivor, as well as Dr. Steiner, and then Phil Beard from German. And I already had introduced Sterling. So I guess we'll go ahead and call for questions from you and comments that you might have about the lecture series. Any questions that you have left that have not been answered that you feel are important. And I also would remind you of some of your comments on the questionnaires and in your papers that were very good in terms of your responses to some of the deeper questions involved, the moral questions, the political questions of the Holocaust, and how this is going to affect your lives in the future. Do you want to say something specific?
I just want to thank formally all the faculty and all the people that participated in making this lecture series a reality. And that is a very important thing, because that's above and beyond the call of duty. And they donate their time for all practical purposes to participate in this event. I also like to ask Mr. Harris to stand up and thank him as a president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust, who is donating money and helps us with the organization of lectures and the timing and what have you. And we have some other people here from the Alliance. Please stand up. Ms. Zucker and Judy Hart. And we have some other people who are diehards, who always help out whenever they are needed. And this is Dr. Jean Kravitz. And I like to have also the privilege to thank the students for a very difficult semester, because it certainly was not easy for you to go through all these sort of emotionally and intellectually various types of tips, which I'm sure may have taken some toll. Thank you all.
I guess I'm going to attempt to moderate this. Did the faculty want to start off with any comments, or should we just take questions? You had something
I
you
have
wanted
the
to say,
impression
Phil?
that the people who had been, whose names were on the list, scheduled to be part of the panel, as opposed to myself, had some remarks that they had prepared. That's the way the papers in front of them look.
Phil is over-interpreting what I have here. This faking it. I have a bunch of notes about something else. So it will look like I'm ready to do something.
Yes, I have student papers here, so that's that.
I have a notebook here because my memory is fading, so.
It's not fading very much, is it?
Well, can you clarify this for me, Dr. Steiner? Do these...
Well, what we really need to do is perhaps dwell on some of the most important issues which could not be discussed because there was enough time, or you didn't think of some questions which you wanted to ask and didn't have a chance to do so. This is precisely what we really want to do primarily. Now, when we run out of questions, then we can give some sort of a short summary in terms of what we consider as faculty to be the most important thoughts which have come up during the semester. So we can do that. But first, I think we need to concentrate on those who have important questions and respond to those questions, feelings, doubts, ideas, and responses on your part. And that's the primary purpose for our session today.
I have a question. We talked a little bit about the idea of what are the chances of it happening here. And that was something, what are the similarities and the differences between here and Germany, but also not necessarily for the Jews, maybe toward the blacks. Could the blacks be the next group focused on in the same treatment, the genocide type idea, or at least to be gotten rid of? And I was wondering if any of you could comment on some of the similarities and differences in the situation.
Are you asking someone specifically to respond to that? Anyone would like to respond to it? Different. Like to respond to that? Anyway, no one wants to respond. I'll respond.
Okay, well, I'll respond to it.
Yeah, I just want to say something, I suppose.
Okay.
It's, of course, it's impossible to put oneself forward as an accurate predictor of the future, and certainly it would be unfair and inaccurate to say that it looks as though right now there is cost about to happen, just poised on the brink of happening towards any particular ethnic or otherwise defined group. But I think it's important to keep in mind the ways in which the kind of discrimination and brutality that were practiced against the Jews in Nazi Germany are in fact being practiced all the time, if not just here as well as in other places. It seems to me that, one thing that troubles me a lot about studying the Holocaust, because it hits home, namely it hits me, is that I become aware ever and again of my own tendencies towards categorizing people, limiting them by my own superficial understanding of them, and treating them discriminatorily by virtue of my own categorization of them. And I know that if I do that, well, I don't think I'm that abnormal. I assume that a lot of other people do it, and I perhaps arrogantly assume that some other people do it a lot worse than I do. And I see it happening in various ways. I mean, in my opinion, it has happened in the last few months in the way that our government, with the support of a great majority of our populace, has treated the people of Iraq. Whether something like that could happen within the bounds of the United States, well, you yourself mentioned the way blacks are treated. One could argue that, I mean, obviously we're not exterminating them, but we are just as obviously discriminating against them in terms of the social opportunities that social and educational opportunities that our society gives to black people. And it's not just black people, it's Hispanic or Latino Americans as well, and Native Americans, of course, who Holocaust against. Pacey Harold Alderman, who would disagree with me about that. But
he's about to on several things.
But the fact is that, this is a pretty violent society. It's not the only violent society in the world, but it certainly is one, and it's something that we lose sight of. Those of us who are in the privileged middle to upper white classes, we don't get an awful lot of it, we don't get much taste of that. We certainly don't get it taught to us very much in our schooling. So I would just recommend that, I mean, trying to predict whether something, some terrible event like that is going to happen seems to me to be a losing game and perhaps a trivial and silly one. But being aware of the ways in which, you know, the tendencies towards it exist and the ways in which on a smaller scale discrimination is happening, discrimination which easily could expand into some kind of generalized brutal treatment, which in its most extreme form, of course, then becomes genocide or a Holocaust. Being aware of that kind of thing strikes me as one of the most important things that educated people can do. I'll just stop there.
There's a question in the back right
I
there.
want to respond.
No, yeah, we still are not
Okay.
finished.
Dr. Harold.
Actually, I did come with a set of remarks, but I was embarrassed because I seem to be the only one here who did. And when we started this in the beginning, this long months ago, I had a long one, and I took a lot for which I got pilloried by our interlocutor. No, I think some of the things that Phil said are the kinds of things that I really object to in this course, the way it has gone this semester in some of its regards. And I think the idea of comparing to what's going on in the Persian Gulf to the Holocaust is absolutely absurd. And I think that the willingness to connect these two kinds of events shows a kind of higher responsibility, a lack of faithfulness to the notion of the Holocaust. And I remind you that in the beginning of this, I said every English word, every word in every language functions in two ways. One is evaluatively, that we use words to disapprove of things. And I think that Phil Beard has just used the word Holocaust in such a way that it has absolutely no descriptive content at all, but simply is used by him as a word to mean he really seriously disapproves of what went on in Iraq. You may do that, and I think there are good grounds for doing that, but to compare us is so far out of the bounds of rational responsibility that, frankly, it makes me feel a little ill. Only a little bit. The other question.
I'll give him some Thomas.
No, I think he needs a glass of water, maybe.
The other question, I think John Steiner started this unfortunate trend because he, on the first day when the war had just begun, said, and this Holocaust we currently have going on in the Persian Gulf. John Steiner is a man who was in Auschwitz and Dachau and ought to know better than to do something like that. Now we go back to the beginning. Another Holocaust was said to have been the American Indians. I sat here and listened to Victoria Bomberry say some extraordinary things, and I had already done the research for them at the time, but the audience, you, seemed so moved by what she was saying that I felt if I got up and said what I had to say, I'd rather be like a fascist at a socialist rally, and I just didn't want to do that. But today I'm going to do it because I went back and looked at the tape, and this is what Bomberry said. She said at a maximum population of 12,250,000, which she got some number from somewhere about the American Indian population, and she used that to talk about genocide in terms of the fact there were a very low number of Indians left in the country. Well, I went back to the statistical abstracts from 1790 on, and there is no data about the population of American Indians in 1790, 1800, 1810, 20, 30, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. Not until 1900 do you get any population at all for the any data at all for the American Indian population. Yes, there were censuses. Don't correct me when I'm talking. Now, the best data available, which is in the statistical abstract, in 1980, the population of the American Indians was, 1970 rather, was 1,420,000. Today it's 1,534,000. As far as I can tell, the population of American Indians, including the Aleuts, the Eskimos, never came anywhere near anything like 12 million or 10 million, which is another figure I ran across in searching the literature. The data's just not there. The census has been going on since 1790. Holocaust. The Indians, however they were treated, whatever the nature of that conflict was, it seems to me that we do not advance rationality and intelligence one iota by calling it Holocaust. There are lots of other words we can use to disapprove of it. In fact, I would think that this may surprise my esteemed colleague, Mr. Beard. I want to disapprove of it too, but I'm not willing to call it anything just in order to express outrage about that. Remember this, folks. Language is essential. And if you talk foolishly and you suffer from the Chicken Little syndrome, the sky is falling, when it really falls, as it did during the Holocaust, nobody's going to believe you when you say it all the time. There was no Holocaust, the American Indians and the Europeans. There was a bloody and devastating war in which one side had all the weapons of great destruction. And if we are going to talk about the Holocaust, one of the primary moral responsibilities we have is to be honest about it and not just to call anything a Holocaust which we want to disapprove of. And when we do that, we dishonor the memory of the 8 million or the 6 million or the 7 million Jews, gypsies, and so forth who died in Europe at the hands of Nazis. And when we do that, we show that we ourselves are willing to hook factual data to our deep felt emotional needs, and to let our emotional needs and our values overwhelm the facts at all. I looked around when I watched Victoria Bombre giving her talk, and there were people sniffling and crying in here. I'm sorry, deep felt values, emotional needs do not change the facts. But they did in two significant 20th century situations, under Joseph Stalin, two totalitarians of a different sort of extreme. And when you let the factual data be changed by your needs or by what you take to be your values, then you're involved in an intellectual dishonesty that leads to the kind of things that led to the Holocaust.
Thank you. Would anyone like to respond to that?
Yes, I would.
Okay, Gene, I guess you're first.
First, I'd like to compliment Dr. Alderman on his comments on trivialization of the Holocaust. I think that his lecture should become a permanent part of this series, like our history and a few others in the beginning. It's a very, very significant point, and I want to thank him for doing it. And in relation to the Indian story, I thought he was going to bring it, but he stopped. I'd like to hear him comment on the term ethnocide, particularly in the relationship to the American Indian.
Or even genocide,
No,
which he didn't use that word.
Ethnocide, and the definition of ethnocide and the relationship to the American Indian situation.
Well, you see, from what I just said, one of the things that responsible people do is when they don't know about something, they don't talk about it. So I'm not going to talk about it because I don't know anything about it. I mean, I know as much about the history of Europeans and American Indians here as most of the other people in this thing do. Now, I could, consistent with what I've said, make up some nice things now, but I'm not going to do that. I want to be the model of what I said. I'm going to be reserved in this and not talk about that because I don't know it. And the only lecture we've had in here didn't give us much data to think about it either.
Unfortunately, there are no Native Americans here to respond to this, and I want you to note that.
But okay, I will answer.
No, it's okay. Enough.
Joel?
Yeah, I want to talk about a different subject. Something that we just skirted on, and Dr. Steiner, I think this is primarily for you, is that one of the ideas that I got from this class was that still today in contemporary German society, there are deep pockets of anti-Jewish feeling and racism. And if that's the case, I mean, I would like to hear from you how much you think contemporary German society still holds the beliefs and opinions that they held during World War II, and if we do have those deep pockets of anti-Jewish feeling still going on, what can we possibly do about them? Are we ever going to eradicate them?
Right. Well, there are two things which we need to remember in this connection. That first of all, you've got an official government policy which is philo-Semitic. That is to say, which propagates the acceptance and restitution for the past and acceptance of those who are there. And there are not that very many. It's just about 40,000 to 50,000 Jews living in Germany today. So, and then among the population, just similarly as it existed during the Nazi period, where there was an official government policy which was anti-Semitic, today we have this sort of equivalent of philo-Semitism, which is really the sentiment of the people at all. Now, the sentiment of the people is still anti-Semitic, and I wouldn't say any different than it was before World War II and before World War I, for what I know. But except the targets are not present, see, because there are too few people to really be anti-Semitic against. So that's one of the problems, because there's no outlet for it, in other words. So if there's no outlet for it, then they are looking at people, and I think, for example, the laborers who come in from Turkey and elsewhere are now the more immediate target, more so than the Jews are. And that has shifted to a large extent to the Turks and the foreign laborers who have been brought in when there was still more work than people to carry it out. This is beginning to change substantially, by virtue of the fact that you've got East Germany now as part of the of Germany, of larger Germany, and the infrastructure of that particular East Germany is of such nature that they are obsolete. All the various industries which they had, they are obsolete and therefore are no match, can't compete with what exists. So therefore, there is a great deal of unemployment. When there's economic problems which beginning to show in Germany, the softening of the mark, what have you, and unemployment, economic, existential insecurity, then people turn against those who are a minority and tend to be pointed out as responsible for the social economic ills. So they are finding and searching for searching and finding scapegoats. And they are primarily the foreigners who stay there and have become citizens, and the Jews, which is again a traditional situation, because anti-Semitism was not invented by Adolf Hitler. It was used by Adolf Hitler for his political purposes. All right, now in Germany. So that would be just about Germany. And however, the official policy is, as I said before, philo-Semitic, and they try to somehow balance the situation as well as they can. Also, there are offices, government offices, which are responsible for public education, schools, universities, the public in general, disseminating literature which is to correct these problems. Enlightened literature, which is based on very careful research written by eminent scholars and other people, films, what have you, to in public as to what is what, and neutralize any sort of racism and anti-Semitism and what have you. The situation is worse, I would say, but you haven't asked that question, worse in Austria, because Austria has been traditionally much more anti-Semitic than Germany. And that is still rampant there, in the fact that there are even fewer Jews in Austria than, relatively speaking, in Germany. Have I answered to some extent?
Yes, just one quick question then. Is Simon Wiesenthal still living in Austria?
Yes, he's still living very specifically in Vienna.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask if Phil or Elke had something specific about contemporary German attitudes they wanted to add at this point.
I'd like to, I'm from Germany, but I haven't lived there in the last 20 or so years, but I don't know.
You want to stand up?
Yeah. I am from Germany, but I haven't lived there in the last 25 or so years, but I've been back to live there for a short time, several times, and I have a lot of contacts. Of course, not being Jewish, I don't have the same experiences that Steiner does, but from my experience there, I got the younger people there. I wouldn't say that you can generalize that the younger people there are anti-Semitic. Of course, as Dr. Steiner says, they don't have any contact with Jewish people practically, but it's just a very complicated society. I don't think you can come away with the impression that there is very strong anti-Semitism in Germany only. It's just as complicated as here, where we have very strong racists and people who are not racist at all. And I would say that the majority of the young people in Germany are not anti-Semitic. They just haven't had the experience, and their parents would be in their early 50s or so, and they haven't had the experience either. So I don't think that that would be a question to come away from this course. You know, I think that in the older generation that's probably still there, and we don't hear it very much, but John might experience it as he did in Austria and so on. But it's not simple at all. You know, just like here, you can't just say it's one way or the other. You know, there's a whole strata of opinions towards minorities here too, and it's just like that there only, I would say.
Well, I got the impression from your lecture that you thought there was pockets of racism, not that the whole country was racist. But
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's basically.
The young people are different from the old ones, but they have learned from the old ones, and prejudice is learned from those who are your role models. And there is not enough interaction going on between the young German people and the Jewish people, and therefore the whole thing is academic, more or less. But they still have feelings, and these feelings are very much colored by those who taught them. And very frequently they've been taught by people who still are the older generation. And therefore they have instilled in them some feelings which may be perpetuated if they have a cause and if they have a target. Have I made myself clear? I think that's to say.
Did you see 60 Minutes the other night? They did a thing about East and West Germany and how...
No, I haven't. No, I haven't.
Some prejudice now from West Germany.
That's right. But I've read about it and I've heard about it, and yes, so obviously because they are viewed as rivals, the East Germans in terms of well-being, somehow not being able to perpetuate the type of well-being which existed here, and now they, of course, whatever bad times may be in the making, will most likely blame those who are responsible for that, whom they not so long ago welcomed into the larger, greater Reich. Well, I've just predicted some time ago that this is not going to be smooth sailing, and that was obvious to anyone who was thinking and reflecting on it a little bit more serious terms.
Okay, David?
Yeah, I think when you talk what the current German government does towards fostering acceptance and so forth, it also should be added that they actively censor and vigorously censor all material that they deem to be damaging to the youth. And that includes a lot of opinions that America allows to flourish uncensored. So that's one aspect.
What's an example of that?
Well, many of the clamors or anti-immigrant propaganda that is disseminated is actively censored.
Clan, I don't understand the word clan.
Well, literature that some way preaches hate against what would be called people of color or anything like that, where that is within our First Amendment rights. It is not within the Germans' First Amendment rights at all.
Well, I think I disagree with that, because there's plenty of literature which I'm getting all the time, and which points exactly to the opposite. So, with few exceptions to the rule, the tendency is indeed to be very permissive in that type of literature which is very clear-cut, racist and anti-Semitic. So I totally agree, because the facts are, you know, the publications which do exist, and I can give you a list of publications which do exactly that. What you say is forbidden. I think you're absolutely wrong in that.
No, I just want to say, being neither a German nor a sociologist with any particular finesse in contemporary Germany, I've recently been reading in the press about some video games that are apparently very popular in Germany. And one of them has to do with shooting an inmate before he gets out of the camp, a concentration camp. And the other one has to do with designing gas chambers and execution chambers just to efficiently get rid of Jews, and they use the word. And these are apparently circulating fairly extensively in computer circles. Pardon?
The government is now seizing them as well. While they may have flourished, it was an underground item. It's not something you'd find on the shelf. Is the point.
There were 120 of them, so obviously there was a flourishing market. But it is being curtailed because there's too much uproar against young people being indoctrinated. There were some questions over in here. Yeah.
Yes, I was in Germany kind of in the early, or in the mid-60s. And I found that there are a lot of, how would you say it, I don't know, like what the hippie generation is over here. They were like the Green Party, the Green Party, the Greens, there was a socialist organization, and many of these young Germans felt very guilty about what happened during the Holocaust, and many of them went to Israel and worked on kibbutzes in Israel. And I wanted to ask Dr. Steiner, perhaps, do you think with the reunification of Germany, that a lot of these, what I would call quasi-socialistic groups or quasi-communistic groups, Do you think that they'll fall apart now and that the right wing?
I think that will very much depend on the economic situation to a large extent. And again, when you talk about the Greens, I don't want to start another sort of discussion here on the Greens, but the Greens are very extreme at times and very dogmatic in their philosophy, if you will, ideology more specifically. And I don't particularly feel that are going to liberalize the country or humanize the country in any sort of any form of shape. So that's not something which I expect, because I worked with them and got to know some of them. Perhaps not a representative sample, but enough to see that their notions are exceedingly radical. Whenever we have some sort of radicalization of an ideology, an absolutist sort of own ideology, I think that's when we need to look at it very closely and be very careful and watch them, because the consequences may be dire.
I disagree slightly about the Greens. I don't think they're as radical as he feels, but right now they only have a state position in Germany, except in East Germany they are in the Bundestag. So they do best and they're most successful when they stick to the environmental issues, which are not adequately addressed by any of the other parties in Germany at this point in time. And they get diversified and more radical whenever they go off into some of the other social issues. Ilka probably could tell you more specifics about that. But
I would like to say to you that it's not just the groups, that it's the consciousness that was raised. And what we were talking about were the people in the late 60s that were in the student revolution, and they are all my age now. And they, institutions now, they went through what is called the long march through the institutions. Most of them are teachers or at the universities. And their consciousness is not going to change just because they're not anymore in the little red cells also that they used to be in, you know. And I remember when I was living in Berlin 81 to 83 for a year and a half, that there were some excesses there by one of the senators against young Turkish people, or young men who were supposed to be sent back after 16, even though they might have grown up in Germany or were born there, back to Turkey. And the next day there were demonstrations on the streets, and I was part of them saying, we don't want the Turks to be the Jews of today or tomorrow. I mean, it's a widely alive country, and my friends on the progressive side in Germany are afraid of the right taking over and are disillusioned. But you can't say it's just one way at all.
Well, what brings to mind to me is that back when in the rise of the Hitler's party, there was also the Reichsbahner, who were the socialists at the time, and they would constantly...
Reichsbanner was very right and was not socialist at all, the Reichsbanner, of all the places. Reichsbanner,
yeah.
No, was on the right hand, it was not at all. It was very reactionary right hand and was very supportive of Hitler.
They were supportive of Hitler?
Yeah.
I thought that they were against Hitler.
No.
I'm mixing it perhaps with a communist splinter group.
I want to say something about the Greens too. Just the word radical, I think, is not being used very well. What is really radical is to be polluting the earth, and in many, many different ways that heavy industry is doing in Germany, east and west. So that is very radical. What the Greens are doing is really not radical, but is only radical in a different sense in that they try to go to the roots of things and see what the problems are. So I think we have to be careful about words. There are lots of different ways to use words.
There are also different interpretations of the same thing. It's not just words, but the way we interpret it. The perspectives may differ.
Back there.
Dr. Steiner, I have a personal question for you, and Dr. Ben find it applicable. In your book that we read, Experiences in Nazi Death...
It's not a book yet, I'm afraid. Hopefully it will become one, yeah.
At any rate, you named several instances very graphically where you had to make some pretty dramatic decisions. Have you, especially because of the series and every semester going through this again, how have you dealt with some of those decisions? Do you view them differently now?
Well, I don't differently, necessarily, but you keep on learning. And hopefully, as we grow older, some of us, instead of getting only senile, we also may get wiser. or both, whatever I know. And so I gave an account which actually was started in very specifically in 1953. And all I did is actually just polished it a little bit and did it in a way which was perhaps more readable. So I was trying to reflect on the situation primarily as I experienced it, and not to interpret it too much, except in my, introduction. And also in my conclusion in terms of what have I learned, so how will I behave in the future, which will reflect some sort of understanding which I may not have had without that of experience. Well, first of all, I try to be more accountable, to be sure, not think in ideological, absolutist ideological terms, look at things from different perspectives, understanding that a perspective is very different from in ideology, because perspective enables you to add new information to your perspective rather than keep it out, which ideologies have a nasty tendency to do. So that is something which I've learned, and also perhaps to be more sensitive towards the needs of other people and be more involved politically, socially, academically, and all that. To assume the type of responsibility we are capable of if we have some degree of experience and knowledge others don't. And be a voice, if necessary, in the wilderness. And very frequently I'm that, even if we talk about the panel, we have types of notions looking at the same thing, except we have different experiences and we have a different background and we have studied it differently. And some have done research and some don't have. And that makes a bit of a difference. So yes, the more we learn, the more insight we can gain. So when there is some sort of a reality situation in which we need to be alert and careful about, in order to not support it or then I think we need to act accordingly. So it's just a question of being consistent, a question of being vigilant, it's a question of being knowledgeable. And that's why we are at this place, an institution of higher education, of which we are a part, and that's precisely what we are doing here, educating ourselves about the Holocaust and the prevention of a future similar occurrence, regardless how we call it. And we call it Holocaust. Holocaust is genocide. And not all genocides are Holocaust.
I guess the question I'm sort of afraid to ask, because I know it's a very personal question, is do you ever deal with these decisions and think maybe you made them incorrectly? Did you ever make a wrong decision now in hindsight?
At that particular time?
Yeah.
Well, I think there is one particular thing which I told my parents. Get the hell out of here while the going was good. And as a child, you know, as a 12, 13-year-old. And they simply said, nothing can happen to us because we haven't done anything. We are innocent. And there was no precedent. There was nothing which we could really compare it with, because these were viewed, and that's an important thing, authorities were viewed as, in essence, basically just, and particularly in Czechoslovakia, and for practical purposes, Germany also, you know, in essence, just. So therefore they said, since we haven't done anything, not very much can, it may be a very bad time, and what have you. And then I said, hey, all the possessions we've had, don't give it to the Nazis, which of course absolutely ought to give it to them, but instead of obeying that, just bury it. And they laughed at it and said, we can't bury that, we have to give it to them. We just, can't, we have to obey authority. Now that's another lesson I've learned. I'm just not going to blindly obey authority in the future unless I have good reasons for it. And then I don't obey, then I cooperate.
And then it's not blind.
Huh?
And then it's not blind.
And then it's not blind, exactly. And so that is a very good point. So that's one thing, and therefore I'm known as a person who just not easy because some do this or do that. I say why, and if you don't have any good answer for it, I say, well, I'm sorry. In that case we have to reconsider why I should do what you asked me to do, and that includes faculty and some of the administrator and paper pushers.
And some of your fellow symposiasts.
That's right, absolutely. And then I say, hey, go back to your wherever you come from and read a little bit more which you haven't read, you know, because you just simply can't espouse things without having done some research.
That's right. He says that to me all the time.
See? And I still say. And I will keep on repeating it.
He didn't mean to me.
No, because he's doing, I really have to give, he's doing, he's one of those who really does, and some other ones are following suit as well. And they better, because otherwise he's going to kill them with words.
I want to hear Paul Beacon's response. I want to hear Paul Beacon's response.
To answer your question.
Word murder. Yes, I would like to hear Paul.
I don't come from such a nice country as Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was the only democracy to be considered in what was known the Little Entente. This is not on? Oh, okay.
Does he want this?
Yeah. Just put it off.
If we got an extension, won't go. Paul, why don't you come over here?
Well,
yeah.
As I said, I didn't come from such a nice country as Czechoslovakia. You know, and this was a country where the president of the country interfered in the pogrom against Jews. Personally interfered there. There was an incident in Czechoslovakia where an old abbot was pulled from the hat. Jews were accused of making matzahs, the Passover unleavened bread, from the blood of Christian children, and there was a riot against the Jewish part of Prague, and literally Thomas Masaryk, the first president of Czechoslovakia, rode on his horse between the screaming mob and the Jewish sector and explained to them this was a lie. I come from the disputed area between Hungary and Romania, which is called Transylvania. By some it's called Erdély. In Hungarian it's called Transylvania by the Romanians. And this has been a political football for probably the last 200 years, and before that also. When I grew up, I did not learn the unequivocal respect for authority that Steiner referred to. What we learned was that there were several kinds of authority. There was local authority, there was national authority, there was formal power, and there was real power, and who was to be feared is mostly what we learned. The notion that you have rights is the strangest notion in Eastern Europe to begin with. There are no such things as civil rights. There's no incident where you can draw a line of your door and say, thou shalt not cross this. And even things got very bad in the United States, and during the McCarthy era, and I was here, and I was a student, and I was a student in Berkeley, and the FBI was investigating everybody left and right, because there were a lot of physicists in Berkeley, and they were hired. You can't get a job in physics without being cleared. So you got to know a lot of gumshoes who come to your door. But whereas came to my door in Berkeley, and if I said, I don't want to talk to you, they just went away. Now, it's true they could have entered, and they probably did enter things in my folder that they said, Benko's a nasty SOB, and he doesn't talk to people. They're right, fine. But they couldn't prevent me from a job. They couldn't prevent me from getting a job. They couldn't prevent me from going to school. They couldn't interfere with the exercise of my rights. Now, all of this, I learned an incident shortly after I got to New York, because I had an aunt there. Some of you know about this. It's one of the illuminating incidents of my life. My aunt came to this country in 1928. She spoke with a heavy accent. She was about 4'11" and a half. And she was a rather tiny person, and the day I arrived in New York, she picked me up at the railroad station. She took me home, and about 5 minutes after we arrived home, a burly New York cop was at her door, knocking on the door. Of course, we didn't see him. When she opened the door, we saw him, and he was so big that he darkened the hallway. And having recently arrived from Europe, I was looking for the window. And we were on the 5th story, but I was looking on the window, and I was going to get out of there, one way or the other. I wasn't going to go back to any incarceration. And I was looking around whether I could jump to the next window and so on. And he said to her, are you Mrs. So-and-so? She said, what's the matter with your hat? That was her answer. what's the matter with your hat? And my heart was beating. And then he took his hat off. And then she asked, do you have a warrant? And he said, no. And he asked to come in. She said, you have a warrant? No. Stay there. And, you know, I thought the world would come to an end. We would both be arrested. We'd be in jail for the rest of our lives and so on. You know, the idea that one person can draw a line in front of legal authority is one of the miracles of the world. Now, unfortunately, that's practiced in very few ways, and it's often violated. But the existence of that is a revolutionary idea that we need to pass across a lot of minds, including the minds of people with very good intentions who'd like to run over our rights, whether they're from the right or the left. Anyhow, to answer your question, when I reconsidered my decisions during the war, they were never framed in the sense that I had any right. My only concern was to survive. I wanted to survive that I wouldn't regret. That was my father's wisdom. We could have survived in ways that we could have regretted, but we didn't, because we knew that there is an after period. One of the aspects of the Holocaust was, and it was terrible in every way, is that we knew that there was another world. Now, the tragedy of incarcerated prisoners are that after a while, they give up the view that there is another world. The notion that there is indeed another world that's opposed to this, that doesn't exist this way, sustains people. That's why it's very, very important in every way for us to sustain those who are prisoners today, whether they're prisoners of conscience, or whether they're oppressed, or whether in any way. It is very important. But as far as viewing our actions in regret, I regret that my mother didn't get out when she could have. I certainly regret that my father didn't. He certainly had the influence, he had the connections, and he had all that. He thought, probably as John's parents thought, that this will blow over, or he could manipulate the situation. You have to remember that following the First World War, there was enormous chaos in Europe. There was vast inflation. There was vast dislocations. And those people who voted to stay there had survived and had manipulated this, and they were deceived by the magnitude of the storm because the front clouds didn't look that big. We didn't believe people when they said that Theresienstadt, terrible place. And we knew about the Theresienstadt. We didn't believe it because we couldn't believe it. After all, my grandmother grew up in Vienna, and she taught German, and we weren't even allowed to speak Yiddish at home because she had taught German. So the frame of mind wasn't to be apprehensive entirely. Now, what we're grateful for is that we learned to distrust both Romanian governments and Hungarian government, no matter what they said. As a matter of fact, the reason I was deported was not because of Germans. The German concentration camps were full. The Hungarians signed a treaty with the Romanians that they would deliver the Jews to the Germans and they would take them. The Hungarians insisted that the German government take them. That meant that 450,000 people, 450,000 Jews lived in Hungary in 1940, and of those, I'm not sure that 200,000 are alive today. Now,
Did you ask? Harold, you wanted to ask each of them a question, is that right?
Well, I wanted to ask them both the same question. It's always difficult for me after hearing John and Paul Binko talk about the Holocaust to say anything. I think most of us in this room, even those of us who have worked at it theoretically, don't still really know very much about it. And I think in the end, nobody, not even John and Paul, knows really much about it in the sense that you can explain what went on. So I'm reluctant to ask the question that I wanted to ask, but it's kind of a follow-up question from yours. Over the years, both Paul have told me about being incarcerated under the Nazis, and they have at the same time explained that their next thing they did was then run from the Soviets. And I ask, as a very serious question, why is it the case that this other major form of 20th century totalitarianism is mostly exempt from discussion in a course like this? Because as I heard you both have said to me upon occasion, that as far as everyday life goes, you couldn't tell the difference in them, and you were incarcerated by the Nazis and ran from the Stalinists. So this is a general question directed more at John, but personally at Paul. The general question is, John, why isn't there a built-in discussion of the murders under Mao and Stalin as a constant part of this course? Because we act in here as if the only excess in the 20th century is the Nazi excess, and it's not. In terms of numbers, in fact, I say this to you, but Hitler turns out to be a rather minor killer. And I'm waiting to have built into this course a session called totalitarianism, in which we look at all of them. This is partly in line with what Phil Beard was saying, too. You know, the easiest thing in the world is to spot the totalitarianism in your enemy. The really difficult part is to spot it in yourself and in your own ideology. And it seems to me we would be moving a giant step toward understanding the Holocaust if we could tie a discussion of Maoism and Stalinism with this other discussion. So on a personal level or on a theoretical level, would either one of you want to respond to this line of remarks?
Well, I mean, I can say that certainly there are similarities. However, there was no specific wiping out of minorities to the extent, and particularly you are the one who is always telling us that Holocaust is Holocaust, shouldn't be compared with anything else. Now I'm doing that exactly and apply to, because I don't think there was anything similar in the Stalin situation, although he killed people who were ideological opponents, more so than those people who were different because they're not Russian or they were something else. So Stalin killed people by the hundred thousands because of ideological reasons, but not because of ethnic, religious, or racial reasons. And that is one of the major differences. However,
I accept that. I don't want to confuse those from the beginning, yes.
Okay, so therefore, because I'm just reminding you what you said about the Holocaust. That
don't have to.
Okay. So the other thing is that to me, after I came back from Dachau to Prague, I could see the writing on the wall in terms of what would happen to Czechoslovakia, simply because they already prepared the communists, and the communists, the first communists, were actually those people who collaborated most frequently with the Nazis. And they became communists in order to save their skin, and they're very successful in doing so. And they already prepared with those people who were their leaders, namely the real communists, quote unquote, their takeover in Czechoslovakia. And that I already had an idea was in 46, if not already in 45, I mean. And also in Dachau was this Soviet prisoner of war who had escaped from prisoner of war camps. And they were sent to Dachau or some other concentration camps, because if you escaped and were caught, you were sent there into concentration camps. And so they told me about the situation. One kid who got killed by fellow inmates, Soviet young soldier, told me about the camps in the Soviet Union. So I got very early in the game, when I was still naive and totally green behind my ears, about the situation in the Soviet Union. So I was prepared, and then I could see in 46, 47 what was going to take place in Czechoslovakia, and fought it. And I joined a party which opposed the communists, and then I was beaten up on several occasions and later put into jail because of it. And then I decided there was not enough I could do. I talked to a number of people who advised me whether to stay or not to stay, because I didn't want to escape and be chicken. Asked them where I could do more good, and they said leave. Them was an Archbishop of Prague, a cardinal, later Cardinal Baron. So I left. Now, yes, certainly the Soviets have killed at least as many as Hitler has throughout the course of time, and we mustn't forget that the Soviet regime lasted much longer than Hitler's. So he had more time, the communist dictators had more time people than Hitler did. And they did. So yes, any totalitarian regime is most likely to behave in a similar fashion. And I agree with Harold on that, to be sure, but there are distinctions, namely the reasons. We can indeed reduce it to this type of ideology, which I warn all people not to be blind believers. And I keep on telling my students one thing, which I'll tell you and then I'll shut up, is what Carl Gustav Jung said when he was asked to believe in this or that. He said, I can't believe for the sake of believing it. I either know something and then I don't need to believe it, or if I don't know it, I can't believe it for the sake of believing it. And I think that's a very good rule of the thumb in terms of how to look at things, how to look at events and analyze them. And that's what I'm trying to do. Another thing which I wanted to say, and that's the last one for sure, the greatest loss which we have suffered, and something which never can be done, is not just the health which may have been affected. In some cases it has, in some cases it has not to that extent, but the loss of family. There is no substitute for that. And somehow we have not emphasized it, that you don't know what it means to lose all the relatives, all the people who have been close to you, particularly when it was a harmonious extended family. There is no substitute for it. And that is the worst thing which could have possibly happened to us.
Well, to follow up on your question, at the end of the Second World War, I never went back. I spent, right at the end of the Second World War, I became, after I was liberated, an interpreter in an Allied war criminals camp. And I had a chance to see the dossiers on a number of people, including Tiso, who was the Quisling of Czechoslovakia. And Tiso.
Yeah. The Slovak.
The Slovak Quisling.
The Slovak, he became a president. He was a president.
Right, and they're just now putting a tablet up for him in Slovakia. You won't believe it, but that's true. Anyhow, the amazing thing to me was that it was clear that the excesses that occurred were not accidental. They were well planned. They were carried out. Now, just before I became an interpreter, after I was an interpreter in the war criminals camp, this camp became a displaced persons camp. And during that displaced person camp, there were a lot of people who were Ukrainians who were in that camp, and the Russians legation came, and a detachment of Russian soldiers came, and they presented the documents with a list of names of the people who were in this camp, and they had a very accurate list about who was there and from where, and they asked to be deported. There was a confrontation between the American soldiers who guarded the camp and the Russian delegation who was taking some of them out in their car, and as a matter of fact, they were shot at. This was in late May of 1945, because the Russians claimed that these people had been collaborators, and the American guards claimed that these were prisoners by the international conventions, and until they received proof of this, one was not supposed to deport anybody against their will. The debate was won by a telephone call to the Third Army Center, and the people were released. But that night, there were 10 suicides among the White Russians in this camp. And a warning that things were not too well behind the Iron Curtain. And then we discovered from some people who came back from Eastern Europe that there was a fight between the local communists and the communists who had fled most Eastern European countries that were taken over by the communists, some communists fled and some stayed and organized the cells. And so there was a bitter political fight. But to make a long story short, it was obvious that nobody was going to go free if one returned. So I entertained no notion of returning. It was perfectly clear to me that if I went back home, I wouldn't get out. And travel in the West was easy, and traveling to the East meant literally crossing the Iron Curtain. And the Iron Curtain was, in effect, way before that speech in college in someplace in Missouri or wherever. The events that happened in Russia at that time were explained for a long time as the excesses of necessity. That everybody was short and everybody had to do this, and you had to have discipline and order and all that. And we mistrusted the sources of information almost genetically. I must say that if you grow up in Eastern Europe, you're not apt to believe a government dispatch without some skepticism. And having, as a student, taken history in 3 different places, you're permanently skeptical about who's telling the truth. In all fairness, my teachers in the U.S. were less rigid about the ultimate truth than those in East. I've learned ultimate truth from many history teachers. That's why I'm in science. But it's easier. It's easier, you know. It is easier. So in looking at what was the propaganda of the West and the East, and there was powerful propaganda from the West and the East, it was difficult to know what the truth was for time, but gradually the truth came out. And gradually, even by the time of the Hungarian Revolution, you know, I interviewed refugees from Hungary who sounded as if they had just left a Nazi camp the day before. I mean, these guys were dyed-in-the-wool Nazis, and they came over here. And there were others who were dyed-in-the-wool Democrats, and they also came over. I was very confused about what really went on. And I certainly couldn't trust the standard news sources to report these. But gradually the news did come out, and various books, some semi-fictional and others certainly non-fictional, showed that this was an empire of horror. And they were just like us. They couldn't admit that they ever made a mistake. I'm totally depressed that Eastern Europe looks exactly as if the Second World War hadn't happened today. I have friends who overhear conversations in the intellectual coffee houses of Budapest, which are anti-Semitic. I mean, this is a town which was known for having for people hanging from lampposts after the First World War, and for excescide rates because of the excesses of the left and the right, which they went through after the First World War, and then there were the excesses of the Second World War. The only thing I'm surprised that anybody ever goes back to that town. I know it's very pretty, but to live, I mean, I sometimes think I'd like to visit it. I've only saw it as a prisoner. I think you're right. I think we should look at it. But the context that the Holocaust did occur in, the way we perceived, was the gypsies, it was the Jews, it was these guys, and the target of the Bolshevik thrust was the anti-authoritarian. And this meant people who had any other commitment to whatever degree to any other system. This is why they couldn't print other people's languages, uncomplied with the authorities. And we now see that it was a selective. I don't think it's identical to the Holocaust in the sense that if you were a good German Jew, you still got killed just as bad as a bad German Jew, whatever those terms meant. I think that people were at the end of the bayonets of the KGB or whoever else was in charge. be suspected of even thinking against the government. Now, it may be that all this paranoia led to a system where there were more cops than suspects, and so the system crashed, because however wonderful cops are, they produce nothing.
Harold, you have a very brief retort to that, then I want to get to some more student questions.
It's not a retort, it's an agreement. The last three sets of remarks, I think, make clear the Holocaust, capital H, and what Stalin and Mao did are not the same things. I never meant to imply that, but you can compare dissimilar things for the ways in which they are similar, and the ways in which what Mao and Stalin did are similar to what Hitler did, and they're linked by the concept of totalitarianism. I think we've established clearly that maybe this is a deeper concept than that of genocide, because we can, and now we can look forward to including as part of the course forever after a section on totalitarianism.
Just for your information, Steve Watrous did give us a couple of years ago a lecture on the purges of the Stalinist era, in case you'd like to go to the library and see that. It was a very good lecture. We have a couple more things. I want to definitely get to some student responses, and then Sterling also has a presentation. So let's take 2 or 3 questions. What? Well, he does. Everyone else got their chance. The lady back there has been waiting a long time.
So, President Alderman, I want to say something to you. And I wasn't sure if
Can you stand up so we can hear better?
I wasn't sure if I just kind of misunderstood what you wanted as far as the word Holocaust with capital H went. Because it seemed to me that in order for this kind of thing not to happen to other races or religions, that it's important to compare, for instance, what happened in Iraq and Kuwait, and compare what's happening to the different races, like the blacks here in America. I think it's really important to compare that kind of stuff, and it seems to me that, I mean, it is important to protect the Holocaust and what happened there, but it also seems important to me to compare it, because it seems like the whole class is structured so that it doesn't happen again. And when you talk, it makes me feel like you are protecting the Holocaust, and that's good, but it seems like you're also closed to saying that things like that happen in other...
Well, I'm very happy to respond to this. I suppose I can have about a half an hour. I just wanted to see what she would do.
I'm going to have to sit on him this time.
As far as comparisons, yes and amen. I'm all for that. I am not for identification, for a concept Holocaust, capital H, to describe other kinds of social mass murder or social intimidation or atrocities, John, the sociologist, provides me.
Or massacre.
That's the whole point of this thing. Yes, compare them, but not to say they're identical. And I'm interested in 2 things. I'm interested in preserving the integrity of our memories. Because if we start saying everything that we don't like socially is a Holocaust, then we're being really unfair to a whole hell of a lot of people who died very unjust deaths. So it's I'm trying to protect, but it's also the concept of the Holocaust. I want to be clear as we can about what it means, so when we compare it to well-known cases, well-documented cases, we'll come up with something that's intellectual and not emotional. So no on the second part, though. You grab a lot of cases that I don't think we know enough about to make this comparison, and when you do that, what I think you're doing is using the word Holocaust or genocide in the motive sense and not in the descriptive sense, and I'm trying to have us not do that. Period.
The lady in purple.
I teach history in high school, and the historian part of myself has certainly been satisfied with many of the comments this afternoon, but the educator and mother and feminine side of me is very interested in the response by Dr. Bennett and Dr. Beard on what you gentlemen specifically would advise those of us in the audience who are still dealing with these problems in educating the youth. I mean, these are horrible examples to study and to wonder about, but I'm wondering if you gentlemen seem to have a wider, more global vision, if you might share that. If I make myself clear.
I have some remarks that I could do in about 10 minutes, or maybe less.
Can you make it less, but go ahead?
Yeah, I can. I'll skip through it then.
Can you use the mic?
is the abandonment of critical reason and substitution of test feeling for classes. If you do, the totalitarian response for blind.
I thought this was going to be about the implications, the moral implications of the Holocaust, and I changed it a little bit to uses of the Holocaust. And you may have noticed some tensions among the panel today. I was going to talk about this anyway. I want to do three things. I want to tell you about my own inability to fully empathize with other people, people right here in this room and right here on this table.
How close are they?
Next, I want to do a very short exercise. You don't even have to do it while other people could be talking. And finally, I want to follow up with some suggestions for overcoming my inability to empathize with the pain of others. And maybe you would have some suggestions that you could foster later on. My point is that the co-suffering of pain of others requires moral imagination. That would, for example, mean being able to put yourself back in history to the Native Americans and imagine what that was like to be under siege and see your families being wiped out. So to be able to remember to imagine the terror, the despair, the hopelessness, the imminence of torture or execution, and less extreme things that affect all of our lives, boredom, loneliness, longing for love, forgiveness, respect, and approval. There's a philosopher by the name of Gordon Allport who puts it this way: I am one of the people in the world who tends to be down on the people I'm not up on. So I prejudge people. I prejudge people in this room and on this table here. Ben, I don't think, is here today, is he? But he's my example. He's my example. I've seen his video a couple of times. At first I didn't like him. I shunned him. I found him grim. He talked about the Holocaust too much. I didn't give him a chance to tell his story. And perhaps some anti-Semitism was at work in me. And now that I know him and have seen his video, I find him warm and sensitive and generous to others, and a person who is taking back his power and his love of life. There are still people I don't like, but it takes courage to go up to somebody and say, I don't know you really, and I don't like you. Maybe I could care for you if we exchanged our stories, if we talked about each other's joy and suffering. But I lack this courage. After all, it was Bernard who approached me. As I attend various presentations here, I have my moral imagination has not always been at work. I conveniently distract myself by finding moral some of you at the table. This provides me with a momentary illusion of being more moral than you are. It also interferes with any real concern for victims of the Holocaust or for any suffering that one of you might be experiencing. Here's how I do it. First, I insist upon broadening the concept of Holocaust to include other genocides. I am particularly critical of what I believe are my government's crimes against humanity: Vietnam, Cambodia, Guatemala, El Salvador, Panama, Middle Eastern children and teenagers, and civilians, other civilians. The U.S. government, like most governments, is run, I maintain, by insensitive opportunists, and anyone who appears to be supporting them, I quickly prejudge. Next, I choose my person to disparage. You'll come out smelling like a rose. You come out smelling like a rose. I have decided that Harold Alderman is the arch government supporter and that he does not care about human rights. The fact that he is a kind and loving father and husband does not affect my prejudgment of him. I make no inquiry into the nature of his suffering, the kind of suffering we all have. I also don't make it safe for him to show his laughter when just the two of us are together. What is more, I lack the moral courage to approach him. I am like Parsifal in the medieval epic by Wolfgang von Eschenbach, who does not ask the Grail King the question, Herr, was wird dir? Which is, my lord, tell me what is hurting you. I don't ask the equivalent of this question. Instead, I'm content to tell myself he is morally wrong and I am morally right. By treating him this way, I am practicing the kind of attitude which, taken to their extremes, or taken to its extremes, in fact leads to Holocaust. I establish scapegoats. I find people I can blame and condemn. I find it easier to judge rather than to affirm another human being. Perhaps I am an exception. Perhaps I'm the only person in this room who does this. Is that true? Let's see. Would you pass out those things, Bob, real quick?
I made a list of examples, some of them modeled on some of you, and well, on me too, especially on me. And I'll read a few of them while they're being passed out. Here's what I'm like in this room here. I'm going to use you because I'm talking to you, giving you the opportunity to choose this one too. You are a Lockean, the philosopher John Locke. You believe the individual. This is very much about the struggle between the right side of this table and the left side of this table over here.
How about the center?
I'll get to you.
I'm sure you will. No question.
You are a Lockean, the philosopher John Locke. You believe the individual and human rights, that both individual and human rights are the most important thing. You might have to do 2 or 3 people on each one of these things. The power of the state government must be limited because the state is immoral and tyrannical. You are prejudiced against people in this room who say there is only one Holocaust and who argue that other genocides are geopolitically necessary. I'm not sure you actually said that.
Well, I didn't say any such thing.
Okay. People are probably crypto-fascists. It doesn't matter whether you said it or not, then, because this is how I see you. By disparaging such a person, I avoid feeling real compassion for the actual victims of the Holocaust that we're studying about, as well as for the person I am disparaging here, not to mention for myself. The second model is how I think that Harold sees me. You are a Hobbesian, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, the all-powerful state order in a chaotic and anarchical world. People who criticize the state threaten, like Philip and me, threaten your sense of security in the world. You see their criticism as ideological and probably totalitarian. In the long run, they are a threat to individual freedom. People who accuse the state of being complicitous in genocides are capable of affecting the collapse of civilization. By disparaging such a person as Philip and me, you avoid feeling real actual victims of the Holocaust as well as for the person you are disparaging. Here's another possible category you might fit into. And categorizing is already stereotyping, is already objectifying, dehumanizing, but I'm doing it anyway. You are drawn to the Holocaust lecture series out of a lurid and morbid fascination with the Holocaust. Vulnerable naked people holding children, about to be shot in the back of the head. There may even be sexual dimensions to this fascination. It may be connected with male attitudes about rape and violence. This is a dark secret you keep from other people. Rather than think about it, you disparage others for their varying involvements in the study of the Holocaust. By disparaging such a person in this room, you avoid feeling real compassion for the actual victims of the Holocaust as well as for the person you are disparaging, not to mention for yourself. Here's a fourth example. You use the Holocaust as a justification for lesser acts of violence and for the denial of other people's human rights. You support Israel in whatever it does. People who cite Israeli brutality towards Palestinians are anti-Semitic, little better than spiritual co-conspirators to the original Holocaust. By disparaging such a person, etc., you avoid feeling real compassion for the person you are disparaging, not to mention for yourself. There's the fifth one. You are obsessed with the Holocaust. It is the most significant thing in your life. You are traumatized by seeing pictures of the bodies. The horror attracts and repels you at the same time. Your priority is a kind of self-absorption. The big event in your life has more importance than the suffering of the individual that the individuals suffer in the Holocaust. You disparage people and so forth. Each time it repeats. Number 6, you criticize people for being historically inaccurate when talking about the Holocaust. You perform a leap of logic by claiming that inaccuracy of the part means inaccuracy of the whole. You are charming and likable, but also smug and scornful of others' efforts to remember and teach the Holocaust studies. You have a secret agenda. It stems from some pain we do not know about and do not ask you about. By disparaging others in this room, you avoid feeling real compassion and so forth. Number 7, almost through, your connection with the Holocaust, either directly or vicariously, is deep and visceral. You may be someone who wears this pain like a robe of distinction. When confronted by people who have the capacity to be playful or joyful, you are censoring. You do not allow the joy either you or others are capable of. By doing this, you limit their humanity and your own. By disparaging them, you avoid feeling compassion for them and yourself. So that's sort of laid on you possible examples, and my exercise would be a la instructional skills workshop, which I took here last semester, would be for you to, since many of these are not going to fit you, or most of them aren't going to fit you, the ones that I fit into, I don't see right now, but I fit myself into at least 4 of them. You could write your own, and if we'd had more time, you would write down the description of you, how you disparage people, how you objectify them, blame them, they're guilty, and you have your rationalization for not allowing your moral compassion, your moral imagination to be at work. I think this does happen here in this room, and when we talk about Holocaust, I think it certainly is possible to talk about Holocaust or any other word in a metaphorical sense. And my solution for my tendency or my ability to dehumanize is to try to find the courage to go directly to somebody and say, I do not like you, and I need to know who you are so that your humanity and mine has a chance. And that, I believe, is how you avoid repeats of the Holocaust. Thanks for the time, panel.
Thank you, Sterling. I think perhaps the thing we're missing from the 7 types would be the 7 positive types. That would be the role models that we need to be versus the negative that you did, interestingly enough, enumerate. Can we have some, let's see, I was going to try to find people who had not asked a question yet so that we could have, you want to go ahead?
Yes, I guess the immediate response is I need to know, why do I have to say to somebody, I do not like you? Why can't I just say, I'd like to get to know you and keep that part
well,
to myself?
I think that's much better, yes.
Okay. It's just stirred an enormous amount of material in me to start. I'm a Holocaust survivor from the wonderful land of Dr. Waldheim, and I wondered whether Germany includes Austria in a sense. So when we talk about the Germans, is there separation? I'm concerned about where we're going. The older I get, the more insane this experience of what we've gone through becomes. There's no relation. I look at the economy and at lack of education, and yet there are a lot of educated people who were Nazis and thought nothing of doing whatever they had to do. Oh, it's religion. I mean, where do we go? The first time I met some German people after my experience was in Israel in a hotel at the Dead Sea, and it was incredibly shocking to deal with that, and language, which I sort of forgot to speak. But I'm still friends with a woman I met down there who is a wonderful person, and we correspond and we meet. And I hear from other people that there are, good Germans, there are good people. I'm worried about perpetuating the stereotypes, and, how do we let go of the hate or the fear? I don't know where it all comes from, and I don't know how we can stop it. How do we, I don't know whether forgive is the right word, or how do we move on? I mean, today we have an assassination. People don't seem to value human life. What's happening?
Phil, you seem to step forward on this one.
In trying to respond to that, first I want to thank Sterling for, I think, putting his finger right on the nerve and getting right to the center of the issue that I find most important and most powerful when we're talking about the Holocaust, in terms of what it means to us now, where we go with what we learn about the Holocaust. But it seems to me, not to, certainly, I'm afraid that by trying to put a label on what Sterling was doing, I'm going to trivialize it, and I don't want. But it seems to me that if there is a word, in a positive sense, that would best summarize what he is suggesting that we do, the word would be compassion. And it's clearly what was missing, what is always missing. Whenever a given group or a given person stereotypes and scapegoats another group or another person. They're out there, we're in here. I mean, we've talked about this us and them phenomenon or syndrome many times in this course. And so it seems to me that a central issue is, how do we maximize the compassion that we practice? How do we practice more compassion? How do we get past the I don't like you wall? And you know, I wish I had an answer that all of us could tap into. I don't. There are, as Sterling says, you know, there are plenty of people that I don't like and that I avoid. And I'm probably going to continue in many cases. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people who I just don't know, and it's not because I necessarily don't like them, but because for one reason or another I haven't related to them. I felt I haven't had time, or I felt that well, maybe it was their skin color that put me off initially or something. I'll cop to that. And in the meantime, you know, sort of growing up and everything, I've gotten past some of that, I think, just by relating to these other groups, getting past the walls that I was brought up within, just grown up in a certain place. You know, it happened to be a certain place in a certain society that doesn't think much about other people in other societies. It prides itself on being a melting pot in one way, but in another way it's one of the most judgmental and xenophobic societies in the world. You know, this happens. I mean, you know, the way our government does things is a xenophobic thing. And that's, of course, a debatable thing. I would welcome the opportunity to spin that out, but that's probably not, it's getting us off the topic here a little too far.
I'd like to say one thing which I think is...
Well, wait a second. Can I finish, John?
Oh, I thought you finished.
I'm almost done. But it just seems to me that in whatever ways we can personally identify and feel comfortable with, we have to reach out to people and exercise compassion as a positive program, not just sort of think of it as something that automatically will happen if we stop hating people. I'll stop there.
I'd like to respond to that because I think it's a very important question which I've asked myself from the very beginning, and I'm still continuing to work on that. I went back to the perpetrators, you know, to find out what sort of people they were. And that was my solution, finding out, interacting with them and find out what sort of people are they? Are they people, are they something else? And I found out they were very much like I am. And that frightened me even more. So what I can say that we all have these sort of tendencies to behave out of character if we don't watch it, particularly when the going gets tough and we are being challenged and rejected and what have you and behaved to by other people who we they'll totally blame for the way they treat us. There's one thing which I agree with Sterling, not very much else, but is solve conflict by getting to know people. The more I understand, the less I need to hate. And that's exactly the ticket which I'm using for my own purpose. I try to understand what I don't understand. And the less I don't understand, the more I can behave humanely and tolerantly and have no need. And that's exactly what I'm using my time for, and that's why I'm doing research. I'm going back just this summer to have a first time at all a table talk with perpetrators. There will be a broadcast, maybe TV, with people who were perpetrators. One of them witnessed the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, which Phil Beard has translated in. And then talk to other people, and that will be a public issue, will become a public issue for the first time. A person who is a survivor will be discussing in public the situation between their feelings and the feelings of survivors. Now that's my way of coming to terms with something which is exceedingly difficult. And we can say, well, get to know those people whom you hate most. And then also deal with the fact why you need to hate. And very frequently we can see why we hate is simply because there is disagreement and because we have different opinions. And that's not good enough, not sufficient to hate someone. So that's one reason. Why do we hate? Because of usually ideological differences. And as we know, ideologies are myth systems. They are not facts. And then if I look at it dispassionately, I say, hey, you know, I'm hating people for no reason at all.
The man in the back, did you want to ask a question? Okay. We only have a couple more minutes. One or two more questions. Anybody have? Or right here?
Well, I admire the concept of compassion. Having been born and raised in South Africa, the feeling of the secret police arriving at your front door, it's very difficult to stop and ask someone if you can get to know them. And I think that the tragedy of that is that what I come away with is that you can learn compassion in a free society, but in a society where you have the rulers, the oppressors teach the oppressed how to become oppressors, and the cycle continues. So that I value what I read, but my life experience doesn't allow me to truthfully grasp it for all humankind at this point, because I think that unfortunately in our society here in America, I think we sometimes forget just how lucky we are, and the point that our human freedom is so incredibly valuable, and that sometimes in this country we actually take it for granted.
Yeah, well put. Harold, what now?
That's what that's talking The use of the word compassion. I don't know what exactly Sterling means by it or what Phil means by it. It means to feel with or to suffer with. But if you listen to what Sterling tells us, some of which I took quite seriously, maybe more than one point, as John said he did. How many of you in here saw the film on last week on Channel 9 called The Occult History of the Third Reich? Those of you who saw that and those of you who have done other reading may remember that one of the early maneuvers of the Nazis was to throw out critical reason and skepticism and to substitute for it intense passion and feeling. I want to you that you can understand the Nazi movement largely as the German people learning to have compassion for each other and not being able to have it for anyone else. Compassion is not a moral solution. If I, as well as Sterling thinks he has, could feel this compassion for the American Indians, I might have a very intense feeling. But you know what? I still wouldn't have the truth. And in the end, it's truth that will set you free and not feeling.
I agree with you. Yes?
I'm just thinking about that.
Well, I wouldn't want you to get a headache.
Well, I won't. I might get a heartache. Thanks. Somebody over here. Yeah.
I have a question that's a little bit different. I'm just wondering, John taped these last year and I watched them all at home, and because I wasn't able to be here last year, and I've been through this session here, and I've been to almost every one of them, and I've watched programs on television and so forth, and only once have I seen a woman be a Holocaust survivor and speaking publicly. And I'm wondering, is there any reason that this is true? Can I have your perspective?
There are more survivors that are men for a number of reasons. Because it was more likely that they were good work material, for one thing. And women had other considerations. A lot of women refused to leave their children or the elderly that they took care of. And so there were more victims who were women. But I think also the other factor is it's a socialization factor, that a lot of the older women who are survivors from Europe have had a hard time with the language, and they're shyer about getting up in front of people. We survivors here, and we would welcome any other survivors who would like to speak on panels. We realized that we forgot to have a survivor panel this semester. We almost always do, and I can't think of a time when we did not have a survivor panel with a lecture series, and it was missed because we were taking on new subjects and so forth. We hope to remember each year to have a survivor panel because they are the ones who are there. And we did have Dr. Steiner and Bernard and Paul to come and speak with us. And if you do know women survivors, we would encourage them to come and participate.
I go to a group in Berkeley. There are many of us.
Well, but that was here.
Yeah, we have had women survivors in the past, but it just happens that the 3 who are on our campus and 2 on our faculty are men, and so we draw on them broadly.
You should also know that there was a survivor on campus, and she was invited. She declined to participate, and we had to respect that.
Yeah. I think it's about time to quit. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, panelists.